The banquet hall was brightly lit when Clara stepped through the double doors. The royalty of the country club mingled by their tables holding court, with whoever stopped to grovel. Clara pressed her hands down the sides of the red dress she wore. Her hands stopped at the bottom hem, and she gently tugged at it. She knew the women were staring at her, and the length of her dress suddenly felt important. She held one hand on the strap of a black bag she carried over her shoulder. She walked between the white cloth tables, each set with name tags by each seat. The voices were a murmur to Clara as she looked for table 7. She could feel the squinting eyes looking her up and down as she walked. She made self-conscious, warm smiles at the women who measured her, and they answered with squinted eyes and pursed lip grins. She glanced quickly down to the bag at her hip. She made sure the designer's logo was visible. She continued through the gauntlet. She smiled when she was supposed to smile, waved when she was supposed to wave. She spotted her table and felt her shoulders relax as she found her spot and sat. Her heart raced as she realized she was the first to sit at the table. She couldn't stand again. That would be obvious. She clutched her bag in her lap, her knuckles white as she tried not to look at the crowd as they mingled around her. She moved her tongue inside her mouth, trying to fight against the drying saliva as her heart pounded. They were surely wondering why she had sat. No one else was sitting. Why was she in a rush? Oh, poor widowed Clara. She just will never fit in. She could feel the eyes on her as she sat alone at the table, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "Clara!" The voice startled her from her daydreams. She quickly patted her eyes with the heels of her thumbs before turning to the voice. An older woman stood over Clara. Her wrinkled face was caked in thick makeup. She wore a lavender dress, and Clara felt suddenly conscious of her own bare arms as she looked at the long sleeves of the woman's dress. The old woman stood next to a man in a tuxedo who wore a blank smile on his unremarkable face. "Dorothy, it's lovely to see you." Clara stuttered the words out as she stood to greet the old woman. Dorothy reached her left hand out to greet Clara. They shook hands delicately, and Clara looked at the large diamond on the old woman's finger. She felt her own modest ring with her fingertips as she lowered her hand. "We're so glad you could make it. We do so wish Bob could be here with us." The bright pearl necklace around Dorothy's neck moved as she spoke. Clara slid her fingers across the chain around her neck as she watched Dorothy's pearls shift in the light. "Please let us know if there's anything we can do." Dorothy was gone, the tuxedoed man in tow, before Clara could reply. She stood alone, her hands clasped at her waist, and looked around. She saw that the other guests had begun to sit at her table, and she joined them with relief. They all greeted each other with the same country club script as always: spouses and money, weather and financial markets. Clara had been here many times before, but she always had her husband Bob to play the part of a clubman. He knew the drill well, and everybody loved him for it. She loved that it meant she didn't have to join in the act. He would never have stopped her, of course. He would never think to control her. She didn't want to join in, and he knew that, so he helped. He loved her dearly, and she loved him. Clara missed him very much. After the car crash, she knew she could have bowed out gracefully. She could have left the club behind and moved on with her life. But she always remembered the looks the other woman gave her as they whispered to each other. She knew she didn't fit in their world, but she felt some terrible need to try. She was ashamed that she wanted to be seen, but she did. The conversation turned to jobs and shows and charities and everything else the rich loved to be humble about. Clara nodded and smiled. She sipped her drink and ate her meal as the white-vested staff brought the courses from the kitchen. She gathered the courage to comment on the wine and was met with piteous stares and half-hearted agreements. Her face flushed, and she tried to hide behind her glass as she raised it to her lips. The conversation continued past her like a river as she stared at the table. She tried to catch up again, to jump back into the flow, but the voices bounced around the table before she could grab hold. She sat back and watched as the good people chatted across the table until dessert was finally finished. The people crowded the foyer. The staff carried trays of dessert wine between the huddled groups of chatting bodies. Clara didn't bother. She walked through the crowd and no one stopped her. She walked out the doors and to her car and sat at the wheel in silence. Anger seeped in and pushed her embarrassment away. The leather of the steering wheel creaked slowly as her grip tightened. Clara clenched her teeth as she thought of Dorothy's wrinkled, painted face. Clara bent over her bathroom sink and stared at herself in the mirror. The tile was cool on her stockinged feet. Her black heels lay outside the door where she had kicked them off. She took a wipe from the counter and began to rub the makeup from her face. Images of Dorothy flashed in her mind. As the makeup came off, she could see every pore, every blemish, every wrinkle that she was convinced wasn't there yesterday. All she could see in the mirror as she inspected herself was the reflection of Dorothy staring back. She tossed the wipe into the sink and stood tall. She turned side to side in the mirror and looked at the way the red dress hugged her body. She told herself it was cheap, it was garbage. It was why the women at the club dismissed her so easily. She unzipped it, took it off, and flung it into a heap next to her heels. She took her phone from the counter and walked to her bed and sat on the edge while she searched for dresses. Clara stood in front of the shop and looked down at her phone to make sure it was the right address. The street was old. Cracks ran through the sidewalk and plastic bags were piled by a street light, waiting for anyone to take them away. A man with sunburned cheeks sat silently holding out an empty cup. His back leaned against a brick wall. Clara held her purse with 2 hands. It was the right place, but she was stunned that such a shop could sell what she had seen the night before. She had been pages deep in her search for the perfect dress when she stumbled on a picture. It should have been like any other dress she saw, but something about it was different. The store's website was simple, but the photos of the dresses made Clara's heart race. All of them the same, simple black dresses, but each felt completely unique, like they carried their own personality in their fabric. And that fabric, the way the weave caught the light perfectly as it stretched over the curves of the mannequins. She knew she had to see them in person, to feel them in her hands. The shop itself was signed in black writing, sitting above the industrial glass door. The black dress, the hand-painted letters read. There were no windows, no mannequins on display to hook passers-by as they wandered. Just the simple glass door. Clara pushed it open and an electronic chime rang out as she walked in. The store was dimly lit by old lamps that stood out from the ceiling. Peeling paint crawled between the lights and dust floated in the air. The room was small, only enough space for a handful of mannequins. There was one changing room that was hung with a red velvet curtain for privacy. A woman was working on one of the mannequins. It stood undressed in the corner of the shop as she adjusted one of its cream-colored arms. She looked up at Clara. "Welcome," she said. She was an old woman, older than Dorothy, but she still carried the beauty that must have made her stand out in her youth. She did not try to mask her age like Dorothy. The wrinkles that spread on the shopkeeper's face were worn with pride, elegant marks of life lived and living. "Hey, hi, I saw your website." Clara held up her phone, though it showed nothing on the screen. Ah, yes, and did anything catch your eye? The shopkeeper gestured around the room. Clara couldn't exactly place the woman's Eastern European accent. Actually, yes, Clara said as she walked to one of the mannequins. It was the dress from the first picture she had seen. Her heart raced as she reached out and ran her fingers across its fabric. Goosebumps blossomed across her arms as she felt the fine weave and imagined it falling into place on her skin. The shopkeeper walked to Clara's side and looked at the dress. She squinted her eyes. That one does have a way of sticking with you, doesn't it? The shopkeeper grinned. Carla wasn't sure what she meant, but she smiled back. Yeah. It's made with Kelstovken wool, you see. The shopkeeper pointed to the dress. The finest fabric in the world. Clara would not have believed her if she wasn't standing there herself. She couldn't argue. I'll take it, Clara said. She felt light as the woman took the dress off the mannequin and brought it to a small counter pushed against a wall. $500, the woman said. Clara was stunned. She had seen the shop was cash only from the website and was already reaching into her purse to pull out a few $1,000s before the woman spoke. We are not greedy people, the shopkeeper smiled. She could see the confused look on Clara's face. Thank you, that's fantastic. Clara pulled $500 from her purse and handed it to the shopkeeper. The woman put the money in the pocket of her apron and finished folding the dress. Her movements were gentle and precise. Clara watched as she wrapped the folded dress in fine wax paper and then tied the bundle with black linen twine. The shopkeeper pulled a black dress box from under the counter and set it on the table. You must always remember, she opened the box, to treat this dress like a part of you. She placed the tied black bundle into the box. Yes, of course, Clara said, but truly she had no idea what the woman was talking about. She was busy looking at the beautiful bundle as it moved through the dust that hung in the dim light. The shopkeeper put the lid on the box, and Clara felt a shiver run down her spine as it fell perfectly in place. The woman tied the box with the same black twine and held it out for Clara to take. Clara hesitated a moment. She rubbed her fingers with her thumbs as she looked at the beautiful box in front of her. Her eyes were wide as she took the box from the shopkeeper's hand and felt the weight in her own. Thank you, Clara said. She walked out of the shop and back onto the dilapidated street. She heard the shopkeeper's voice behind her as the door closed. We will see you again. The beggar shook his cup, but Clara didn't hear the rattling of the coins as she stared at the box in her hands. The sun was bright, and the day's light reflected off the dark black box. Clara's hands shook as she walked with the box held carefully. Clara looked at herself in the full-length mirror that stood on golden legs in the corner of her bedroom. She turned around and looked over her shoulder. She smiled at the way the dress hugged her body. She took the dress off and hung it in the closet. She left the door open so she could look at it while she fell asleep. She felt her stomach flutter as she thought of wearing it to the club for the first time. She knew the women always looked at her clothes, at her hair, her accessories, her weight. They saw everything, like predators looking for weakness. Well, she would give them something to look at now. Clara walked into the Salt Spray, the club's restaurant, and went to the receptionist. A table for one, please. Sorry, we have nothing available at the moment, the receptionist said without looking up. Please check again. I'm sorry, but... The receptionist looked up at Clara, and her face flushed. Well, let me see. Clara smiled to herself when she heard the receptionist stuttering. She rubbed her hands along her waist, feeling the fabric of the dress with her fingertips. It looks like we can move something around. Please do. The receptionist pulled a menu from a stack and gestured for Clara to follow her. They walked to a corner table, and Clara sat facing the dining room. "A martini, please. 2 olives," Clara said to the receptionist. Clara knew she was not the waiter, and the receptionist looked confused for a moment before acknowledging the order and walked to the bar. Clara looked across the dining room in front of her. Square tables spread with white tablecloths were spread evenly throughout the room. The evening had settled nicely, and the tables were full. There was a light buzz of conversation in the air, and it mixed gently with the piano music that played over hidden speakers. A waiter returned with Clara's drink, and she thanked him as he left the table. She took the toothpick from the glass and slid an olive into her mouth with her teeth. She chewed slowly as she looked into the crowd of diners. Each table was the same. A couple or group sitting over plates of decorative food. Some ate deeply and loudly, while others looked fearful to even glance at the food in front of them. Their voices blended into the sound of the room, but Clara knew the discussions well. She could hear them all in her head, making deals. Deals for money, deals for sex, deals to play golf with such and such, and have dinner with so-and-so, all with the sincerity of an anglerfish. She stirred her second olive in the glass of cold gin and sweet vermouth. Her lips twisted into a mask of disgust as she watched all of this. It was like standing behind the one-way glass as the killer tried to enthrall his interrogator. Her hands stopped stirring when her eyes fell on a table in the opposite corner. It was Dorothy, and the decrepit drone she dragged around and called a husband. Clara took a deep sip from her glass and stood. She straightened her dress and walked toward Dorothy's table. Her strides were powerful as she moved, and her body warmed as she felt the eyes on her. Her lips turned up in a smile as she walked. She couldn't help it. She could hear the hum of whispers as she walked. This time they weren't whispering pitiful words. She knew that. She came to Dorothy's table and stood over her, looking down at the old woman's makeup-caked face. "Dorothy," Clara said down at the old woman. "Clara!" Dorothy's plate rattled on the table as her knees bumped it when she stood. "It's good to see you. We didn't have a chance to speak the other night." The two shook hands. "You were gone before I knew it." Clara smiled as she said this, still holding Dorothy's frail hand. "Well, Oh, it's fine." Clara released her hand. "I was going to ask about next week's fundraiser. You've never... Yes, right. Well, I would like to be on board for that, Dorothy." Clara looked directly into Dorothy's eyes. Something changed on Dorothy's face, a subtle shift that Clara wouldn't have noticed had she not been anxiously looking forward to it. A resignation and then an admiration. A spark came to Dorothy's eyes, as if she was suddenly seeing clearly. "Yes, of course. Please, here, take my card and we can discuss all the details soon." Dorothy handed Clara a business card. "Thank you, Dorothy. And I must say it's a pleasure to see you too, Hank, as usual." The man sitting across Dorothy blushed deeply and opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing as a smile spread across his face. Dorothy sat back down and Clara walked away. She smiled as she heard the conversation fade behind her. "Did you notice something different about her?" the old woman said to the old man. Clara felt the black dress against her body as she walked back to her table. She sat and put the bone-white business card into her bag before finishing her still-cold drink. She slid the last olive from the toothpick and turned her eyes back to the crowd in front of her. She savoured their looks. She could feel her heart quicken as she watched people trying to hide the fact they were stealing glances at her. She knew they had eavesdropped on her conversation with Dorothy, and she imagined what their banal conversation had turned to now. She wondered what they had to say about poor widow Clara, bless her, now. She ran a finger under the neckline of her dress to loosen the tight fabric. It seemed to stick for a moment before it came loose. Clara stood in her bedroom and peeled the dress off. The fine weave of the fabric pulled at her skin as she slid the dress down her body. She pushed her fingers against the red marks that had formed on her stomach. Maybe she was allergic to the wool. She would find out, because she would wear the dress again soon. She took Dorothy's card from the bag she had dropped onto the bed. She held it in her hands and smiled as she remembered the look on Dorothy's face. She picked her phone up and dialed the number on the card. "Hi, Dorothy. Yes, this is Clara. I'm calling about the fundraiser. Yes, I have a few ideas." Clara stood next to the lectern in the banquet hall and looked out across the tables packed with familiar faces. She applauded the man who had just finished speaking and stepped into his place at the lectern as he walked back to his table. She adjusted the microphone down to her mouth and addressed the crowd. "Thank you to Mr. Krasinski and Arrow Financial for their generous support." More applause rang out from the crowd. Clara paused while it settled. "But we can't fix your swing, John." The crowd laughed sensibly at yet another golf joke. "All right, everyone, please enjoy the evening," Clara finished. She raised her hand and waved at the crowd as she turned to leave the stage. A jazz band began playing as she stepped down the stairs and walked to the bathroom. She entered a stall and locked the door behind her. The faint sound of the band could be heard through the walls as she took a small makeup compact from her bag. She looked down at her skin as she tapped the sponge in the flesh-coloured foundation. Red lines seeped from the edges of the dress and across her skin. They looked like veins as they stretched across her pale flesh. She dabbed at them with a sponge, hiding them beneath the makeup. She would return the dress after tonight. The allergic reaction was too much. She finished applying the makeup and left the stall. She checked herself in the mirror while she washed her hands. She breathed in deeply, composing herself before she walked back into the party. The night went exactly as planned. The food was perfect. The band played everyone's favourites, and the crowd hung on Clara's every word. She made her way from table to table like a panther through the jungle. The black dress shined under the chandeliers as her body moved through the crowd. She felt alive, pulsing with the vibrations of the room as the guests competed for her time. She left before the night ended, leaving flattering rumours and raptured smiles in her trail. Clara's back stung as she unzipped the dress. The zipper must have caught on her skin. She went to pull the dress from her shoulders, but it wouldn't come off. It clung to her at the hem. She thought it must have been stuck on the makeup she had laid on thick. She opened her mouth and gasped as she pulled harder. The dress tore at her skin. She looked down at her shoulder and saw the faint red veins beneath the fading makeup. She pulled at the dress again and winced as she saw the veins pull and tear like scabs as the dress finally broke from her body. She squeezed her eyes closed and clenched her jaw as she continued. She pulled the dress from her skin like a band-aid peeled across an old scab. She breathed through her teeth, her eyes still closed as she leaned against the counter. She opened her eyes and her heart sank as she looked at the raw outline of the dress that was torn from her flesh. She stepped her feet out of the dress that sat crumpled on the floor and walked slowly to the shower. She stepped inside and turned the water on. It stung at first, but she got used to it as she washed her fresh wounds under the warm water. Clara walked into the salt spray wearing her old red dress. She wore a shawl over her shoulders, hiding her wounds. She walked to the receptionist and the woman looked up at her. "Yes," the receptionist said. She looked Clara in the eyes and Clara felt panic building. Table for one, please. We have nothing this evening. The reply was blunt. Clara could feel eyes staring at her from the dining room. Could you... No, not this tonight. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the chatter from the dining room grew louder. She knew they were talking about her. She knew they were looking at her old red dress and laughing as they slurped oysters from their shells. Her throat was dry as she backed away from the receptionist. Her back hit the door, and she struggled to push it open with sweaty hands. She stumbled backwards into the night. She walked to her car, and her heels clicked against the ground as she left the club behind her. She wiped tears from her eyes as she drove home on empty streets. Streetlights lit her way as she stared at the lines in the road. She made it home and took her heels off at the door as she unlocked it. She went to her room and took the red dress off. She threw it across the room in disgust and looked at it as it lay shriveled in a pathetic heap. She turned to her closet where the black dress hung. Her tears faded and her mind calmed as she looked at the hanging dress. She took the dress from the closet and laid it on her bed. She rubbed her hand across its black surface. The New Year's banquet was coming, and she could already picture the looks on everyone's faces, the looks of adoration. They would worship her as she walked among them. She shivered as she smiled, and thought of their idiotic grins as she let them speak to her. She laid in bed and pulled the dress to her. She felt the fabric slide against her skin as she drifted into dreams. The days passed and New Year's Eve came. Clara pulled her car near the front of the banquet hall and checked herself in the rear-view mirror. She looked at the red marks that now shot across her skin. They came from the edges of the dress. She did not put makeup on them. She let them stand out starkly. The party was euphoric. Clara floated through the room like an untouchable royal. People crowded her to get their chance to say their piece to her and hear her reply. They parted like waves in front of her when she moved. She could see them staring at the red veins crossing her arms, but she knew they were in awe, entranced by the ephemeral woman in the black dress that designed to grace them with her presence. Clara left early as usual. She said her goodbyes as she waved and bowed through the doors. She saw the crowd watch her through the window as she walked, each pair of eyes moving in the light to follow her. She basked in this wave of shifting pupils until she was away from the building. Clara stood in her kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine. She sipped the red liquid and savoured the sharpness of the tannin as it hit the back of her tongue. She closed her eyes and remembered the night, not in small details, but in a blanket of adoration that she wrapped around herself as she drank. She opened her eyes, and her mouth fell open as she looked at her arms and saw the red veins growing. They shifted and slithered across her skin as she held her hands in front of her face. She rubbed her arm, desperate to stop the spread of the seeping veins. Her breath quickened as she ran to her bathroom. She looked in the mirror, and her heart raced as she saw the red lines creeping up her neck and onto her face. She clawed at them desperately. She could see them coming from the edges of the dress. She squinted as she looked at the dress. She could not tell where the edges ended and her own flesh began. She breathed fast. She felt suffocated by the tight dress now. She pulled at the zipper, but it would not budge. She pulled harder and screamed as she felt her flesh tear. Adrenaline shot through her as she felt the awful spectre of panic creep into her mind. She was hyperventilating when she tugged at the zipper again. She screamed as she tore it down the back of her dress. She almost didn't feel the pain through the wall of adrenaline as her back tore open. Spit flew from her mouth as she groaned. She could feel liquid running down the back of her legs. The veins still slithered across her skin as she turned her back to the mirror and looked over her shoulder. She let out a sob as she saw the bones of her spine showing where the zipper had torn her flesh. Another wave of adrenaline shocked through her as she tore at the edges of the dress. She pulled and pulled, the skin ripping as the dress, now a part of her, tore away from her body. She slipped in a puddle of her own blood, and still she tore at the black dress as she wreathed on the ground in the red pool. Her heart pounded, and she could feel the adrenaline in the back of her throat as she ripped the dress away. It peeled from her body like skin, leaving her flayed and weeping on the blood-covered floor of her bathroom. The monitor beeped as Clara laid motionless in the hospital bed. She was wrapped in bandages, and a small TV droned with the sound of the news. A stream of people from the club had come to visit her. They came to be in her presence again, she knew that, but she watched as their faces changed from adoration to pity, and then to disgust and dismissal. One by one they came to see Clara, and one by one they left her behind to rot in that hospital bed. She could hear them muttering on their way out, chattering about the poor widow Clara, whatever would she do? Clara closed her eyes and thought of the black dress that lay crumpled in a pile of her blood. She smiled through her tears as she imagined its black fabric sliding over her skin again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.